If you understand television, you know that every now and then you do have to have commercials. So let me just say a few more words about our supporting the museum. My experience with something like this is when you're at an event like this and somebody asks you to write a check, when you get back home tomorrow or the next day, you'll say to yourself, I'm really glad I did that. You know, this is a great organization. I enjoyed being here. It really needs to have support. And you'll feel good about it. If you go home and you didn't write a check or you didn't put any cash in the bag, you'll go home tomorrow and you'll say, yeah, I probably should have done something to support that because I want to be able to go back next year and the year after, and I want people in the future to go back and be able to enjoy it and have this preserved for the future. So if we don't support it, nobody else is going to do it. It's up to ours to do it. And I wrote a check during the break, and as soon as I see John, I'm going to put it in the bag. And I really urge all of you to please be sure to write a check or put some cash in the bag before you go home today. Two quick announcements. Is Alan Long here today? Alan Long somewhere? Alan? Does anybody know Alan? He had an item in the auction that they need to check on. So if you know Alan Long, please ask him to check with Daryl over at the auction desk there. There was a question about something. And I have another offer. It was either last year or the year before. I brought a big black metal cabinet RCA color television set. Black metal cabinet. It was supposed to have legs on it. At the time, I hadn't found the legs. Last week I found the legs and I have them in my car. So if you, within the last couple of years, purchased a black metal cabinet RCA color set without legs, see me and you can get the legs, okay? All right, well, we'll get back on our presentations here.
Ryan, is there some chance we could dim these lights during the presentations a little?
Does anybody know how to do that here?
The short answer is no. So either they're on or off.
Oh, okay. All right, the choices are on or off, apparently, so. All right, our next speaker this afternoon is Richard Wirth, and he's going to be talking about television coverage of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, which actually was an event that caused a lot of people to rush out and buy television sets. That was an exciting time. And I found his little bio sketch here kind of fun, so I think I'll just read his exact words rather than try to paraphrase it. Richard Wirth had barely learned to read when his parents brought the glowing box into the living room. By the time he had finished elementary school, he had read all the books about television in the community's small public library. The more he read and, of course, watched, the more he dreamed of one day being part of the world of television production. Stops on his life timeline include a few local stations, several Midwestern production companies, the Armed Forces Television Network while in the Army, and the Motion Picture Association. Along the way, his path led him to NBC's beautiful downtown Burbank and later to NBC News. Always looking for new toys to play with, he launched a venture that became the Network Group, a production and transmission services company specializing in planning and providing production services for ad hoc live broadcasts for the networks and corporate television. Along the way, he added consulting and teaching to his resume. Recently, he retired from the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California, where he served as manager of post-production for 14 years. So please welcome Richard Wirth. Let me give you the apparatus here.
In School of Cinematic Arts?
Electrical engineering.
Oh, okay. The Turby. Okay. So at the first of the year, I wrote a piece for the Pro Video Coalition, which is a company I write for, about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. British television was changed by it, and in anticipation of that day's telecast, the British citizens forked over money for a telly to see the event, which alluded to earlier. Overnight listening habits became viewing habits. It was a quite a time quite a time for the Brits over there. It also was the first international live transmission, and other than some tests preceding it, it was also the first live broadcast to multiple countries and a precursor to Eurovision. Oh. Back. There we go. Can you roll the? Do I control the video or do you?
We got it. Yeah.
Okay.
But eventually they were given the green light, and broadcasting history was made at one of the oldest and most sacred buildings in the capital.
By modern day standards, there will have been a select crowd here to watch the first coronation held here at the Abbey of William the Conqueror back in 1066. But by 1953 there was live television, and 27 million people in this country alone watched Queen Elizabeth II crowned here from the comfort of their own homes.
RAF veteran Peter Dinnett, here on the left at the Abbey 60 years ago, was the man in charge of the live television broadcast. Now in his 90s, the scrapbook he kept of his plans for the programme is among his most treasured possessions. Thankfully, it all went off without a hitch.
We only had very largely obsolescent pre-war equipment, connected with up to 300 feet of cable per camera, and very much subject to rain. So when it was raining on the day, my heart sank. But I don't know whether somebody up there was looking after it, but not a single camera broke down. It's an absolute miracle.
And even religious leaders were won over by the box. A young Dean of Westminster vividly remembers watching it aged 4.
I don't think we could see terribly much, but there was great excitement, there was a great sense of engagement, and that this was a really special moment. We all felt that in the family. I think we all felt that around the country, probably around the world, frankly. We can have that sitting there.
The BBC's live broadcast of the Thanksgiving service 60 years on is a much more straightforward affair, thanks to modern technology.
The cameras nowadays are so much smaller and sensitive to light, you don't need massive light. But also you've got remote cameras, so you can very subtly sort of strap a camera to one of the pillars and operate it remotely, so you don't have to have big boxes with operators inside the Abbey.
Not everyone owned a television, but those who did became very popular, and the success of the broadcast meant London was to be at the centre of TV programme making for decades to come. Sarah Harris, BBC London News.
But I felt the article that I had written was unfinished, like there was more to the story than I was able to tell at the time. I needed to concentrate on limited areas of the subject. So I include an overview of BBC's activities in covering the event, as well as describing the scenes behind the efforts that went into the CBS and NBC race for ratings. The two American networks competed to be the first on the air for a market that in 1953 had already grown to over 28 million receivers in use. At that time, that race was what everybody was talking about, though. It was getting much press coverage, and as my subtitle spelled out, the occasion of the first international television event arrives, but is overshadowed by CBS and NBC in their race to be first. Complaints about American television reach all the way to the British Parliament. Today, I'd like to get beyond the Great American Airplane Race and delve deeper into BBC's challenges subsequent to the article's publication. The amount of writing and researching, as well as the amount of page space allotted, would certainly have gone beyond the confines of a monthly article. In fact, I had discovered an item that ended up containing answers to many of my remaining questions. I learned that there was a book the BBC had published during the year of the nation mourned the loss of King Edward. The book took us up to the day of the Queen's coronation and their groundbreaking television coverage. It was called The Year That Made the Day. I did a search for it. I found there had been a donation of an original copy made to the University of Southern California's libraries, and it was hiding in the Grand Depository. If you remember the scene at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, a janitor wheels the artifacts through the maze of wooden crates in storage. That scene will always remind me of the Grand Depository. The artifact itself looked like a reading book for a third grader. It was about 6.5 inches by 9 inches and only about 80 pages in length. But it was chock full of information and pictures new to me. It covered both the radio and television portions of the coverage. I also returned to the internet and started digging deeper using some alternative approaches the book had guided me to. I don't speak French, so when I encountered the language in my results, I used the free translation services of the search engines. Coming up, we will go through the live coverage of the procession and the coronation. Then the signal jumps to the English Channel to France, the Netherlands, and West Germany. And the final segment will address the restoration of the kinestopes to a pristine condition that previously had not been possible. In 1953, the BBC had 6 outside broadcast vans in operation across Great Britain. Outside broadcast is the British term for mobile unit. 3 were based in London, 1 each in Birmingham, Glasgow, and Bristol. Another older unit was in storage and resurrected to do ad hoc events not directly connected to the coronation activities. The units were brought to London to handle the extensive coverage. Each of the mobile control rooms, or MCRs for short, were trailers constructed to carry 3 cameras and built on articulated trailers. They were designed to be de-rigged relatively easily. The contents of MCR 9 and 10's units were moved into a hut beside Westminster Abbey, and they were to control the 5 cameras covering the ceremony itself. In addition, there was a live camera for graphics. This was the way credits and titles and subtitles were handled back then. The procession wound its way from Buckingham Palace through London to the Abbey, carrying the Queen in an ancient royal coach. The other MCRs were strategically placed along the way. MCR 7 on the Victoria Embankment, MCR 11 at Hyde Park, and the PYE equipment from MCR 12 was set up on top of the Victoria Memorial in front of the palace. This position allowed the cameraman to get superb close-up shots later when the royal family appeared on the balcony. The cameraman used a 40-inch lens mounted on the Mark III image orthicon camera. In all, 15 cameras covered the processional route from the palace to the Abbey. An experiment by David Boothroyd shows a 20-minute excerpt of the outdoor procession covering most of these camera positions. You can watch it at the YouTube site listed on the slide. I think we got out of order here. There we go. Whoops. Okay, it doesn't list it on it. I can give it to you. I have it here if anybody's interested. In the Abbey itself, the 5 cameras were positioned so they could take advantage of the best angles they could get. All the inside cameras were mounted high up and virtually out of sight. They were made to be as inconspicuous as possible. This was a requirement from those concerned that the presence of the cameras might detract from the proceedings. There was a camera over the west door, in the organ loft, over the south transept, and two looking down from the triforum over the rear of the altar. Operating space was the big problem for the cameraman. Since the 5 cameras had to be as inobtrusive as possible, they ended up in a tiny crawl spaces where even the shortest cameraman could not stand up. Their work needs to be admired considering how long they were sequestered in those closed spaces. If you watch the coverage, you can tell where their pan and tilt had limits and where they obviously couldn't go any further. They were quite literally boxed in. If you could roll the video, I'll talk over the first part of it. At one point, a triforum camera has to tilt up into the lights. The artifacts of the new image orthicon camera tube yields huge black halos around the bright lights.
We see the beginning of a procession.
Considering all the parameters they had to work around, they accomplished quite a feat. As producer Peter Dimmick, come on, go back. There we go. There we go. As producer Peter Dimmick, seen here on the left in the Abbey control room, commented in the earlier interview, all cameras were limited to 300 feet of cable to the camera control units. Also, the graphics camera was located close by to the temporary control room to be faded in and out as needed. From the 5 broadcast locations that included the Abbey, the signal traveled to Broadcasting House where a temporary master control room was set up. Counterclockwise from upper left, the monitors are labeled the Abbey, Colonial Office, Victoria Memorial, Hyde Park, Embankment, and Transmit. Radio check is on top. It's probably an off-air feed. In addition to patching all the pictures coming in and going out, video needed to be synced to avoid what the British called frame slip. I had never heard that term before, but I knew what they were talking about. I remember expressing it in terms unlocked or lost sync when I started working. I also remember seeing the old kitoscopes of Edward R. Murrow's See It Now series where they would switch all over the country, and every time they did, the picture would inevitably roll. I happened on some ads in old broadcastings about the same time that RCA invented Gentlock. They called it rollover. So as I read the BBC's little book, I kept wondering how the British public could stand all the interrupted picture changes. Turns out to achieve a stable switch, a new system was evolved by the BBC Engineering Design Department. On all the various remotes, it overcame the breakup. Using a master sync pulse generator at Broadcasting House, the engineers would send sync down a telephone line from the mains and feed it to each camera where at the various sites it was locked to the local waveform generator. A phasing control in series with the signal fed to each line enabled the pictures from different sources to be kept in phase. They achieved an accuracy of a small fraction of one line. Thus, the signals were accurately adjusted so they could be intercut without any loss of sync. From Broadcasting House, the live feed was provided to the rest of Great Britain. In addition, they also fed the continent Decades before fiber, before compressed internet connections, microwave links hopped around Britain to the White Cliffs of Dover, spanned the Inkley Channel, and transmitted through Europe. Testing began as far back as 1931, when the British, working with the French, sent reciprocal signals across the expanse. In the picture, the second dish off to the right there is set up as a receive unit. The offset was to avoid accidentally overpowering it with the send signal in the foreground. When World War II intervened, research was stopped, but they picked up right where they left off when the war was over. Am I not aiming this right or something? Oh, there it goes. The experimental feed on August 27, 1950, supposedly commemorated the first message sent by submerged telephone cable from England to France. The test was in the form of marking the occasion of a two-hour program from Calais on France's north coast. The conversion issue wasn't a problem, as the BBC used their own equipment and sent it back to London live. It was the first time live television pictures that had crossed the English Channel. The BBC equipment at 405 lines did not create any problems. However, engineers noticed a wave moving through the picture, and it was found that microwaves were affected by the wave movement of the ocean. It's most pronounced if you watch closely in the first part of the video on the right. Whoop. Do we have that video? Oh, there it is. See how it's moving? That's a still of it. That's coming across the Tarrant Channel. The method to solve it was to adopt a form of diversity system at the receiving end. It had been found that when one receiver was receiving a wavy picture, the other was stable. To rectify it, the receiver site had to install their parabola on the tower several meters apart vertically. Switching between receivers minimized the effects of the ebb and flow of the waves. On Coronation Day, when the 405 line signal arrived at the end of the multi-hop link to Dover, it was received in an area known as Swingate. From there, the transmission crossed the channel. The receive point at Cap Blanc Ney, told you my French was terrible, forwarded the signal to Mont Cassel, and still remaining in the British 405 line format, was split by the French post office at Mont Cassel. First, it was put on hops to Paris through France's post office network. In Paris, they converted the feed to France's 819 line system for transmission to the French audience. And then the second feed from Mont Cassel was sent to Lille on the French border. From there, the Belgian and Dutch broadcasting authorities made arrangements to pick up the Lille feed and relay the signals across Belgium to Breda in Holland. Breda carried out the conversion from 405 lines to the 625 line standard of that country. In addition to using that format for broadcast to the Netherlands, the signal was also fed to West Germany, who also had adopted the 625 line system. A series of radio links took it to Wuppertal, where it joined up with the German television network. The pictures don't do it justice, but since they're reprints from the BBC book. But if you can read some of these telegrams, it certainly would seem they were acceptable in view of the glowing telegrams that, to the BBC. I haven't described what was going on with sound yet. This is probably a good time to do that. Suffice it to say, most of the Western world wanted to provide their listeners with a live audio presence to accommodate the British provided unilateral feeds of international radio broadcasters as well as international shortwave broadcasts in various languages. In addition to providing a feed for radio broadcasters in their native tongue, the BBC provided an effects track that would accompany the feed to the foreign home country. In the case of television, that effects track was also sent to the countries on the continent. A French narrator was on site in London, but the Dutch and German narrators used a monitor in their home country to take their cues, and the effects track was mixed in from that feed. Previously, the Dutch and German announcers had spent time with the BBC over the weeks leading up to the day, getting familiar with the program schedule. Now to the restoration. Over the course of the 7-hour telecast, everything was recorded on 35mm film at Broadcasting House. In 2013, it was the 60th anniversary of the Queen's ascent to the throne. The films were hauled out and given a facelift. Editors were able to take the recordings back to at least the quality of the original 405 line signal and make it look as close to the original video as possible. They also cleaned up film artifacts that had crept in like dust and scratches. In the next video, BBC's Nicholas Witchell interviews Jonathan Wood, a colorist for the BBC, and as he describes what he's done and demonstrates how successful they were.
The Coronation, 60 years ago, huge moment, of course, for the nation, a huge moment also for BBC television. This really was an epoch-making broadcast, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it was huge, an absolutely mammoth undertaking for an outside broadcast. And I think the first time that the television viewing audience exceeded that of radio. So it was a very, very big moment for British broadcasting history.
In black and white, yes, of course, with, by today's standards, fairly primitive cameras. Pretty remarkable that it worked as well as it did.
Absolutely.
Now, you've taken this original electronic footage, which was filmed, and explained just what you've done.
Yes, the actual original broadcast was on video, of course, but there was no way of preserving that signal as an electronic recording. So they had to basically film the video picture from a TV monitor in simple terms. And we were asked to take that original 35mm film negative and create a new transfer of it. So we worked in high definition. I did a scene-by-scene grade on every shot in each roll. We did a new transfer which also had some slight electronic enhancement in terms of removing fine dust and marks that were on the film image, because we wanted to remove film defects as much as possible, and so that the underlying video original was as it was back in 1953.
And this is the result.
Yes.
Now, how much more detail do you feel this process has revealed?
Quite a bit, really. One, we've gone back to the best materials of the original, whereas previous transfers would have been from a print several film generations down.
The scanning technology has improved remarkably, so we're able to really get the best out of the film image in terms of focus and definition. The actual film recording process originally would have tended to lose a bit of picture around the edge. So one of the things I made sure when scanning this new transfer was actually captured all the image that was on film, right to the very edge. In fact, there's a lot of examples where there's people on the very edge of shot that are now visible, whereas on old transfers they're cut off. So we've got more picture back as well. So here is the moment of coronation, the moment of crowning is approaching, the Queen sitting there on the coronation throne. And we're seeing it perhaps as we haven't seen it for 60 years. Quite possibly, yes. I mean, the actual video line structure is quite visible now, because it's only 4 or 5 line video. But you can see that quite clearly. So the sort of definition that we're seeing now, I think, would have been what was seen originally. Whereas earlier than this, transfers in, say, the 1980s and 90s, and lots of clips you tended to see, wouldn't have captured quite that detail before, because of the older television technology. So, and historic BBC broadcasts now benefiting from the very latest in digital technology.
Absolutely.
So needless to say, I am in awe of the BBC engineers. World War II had left their country in shambles, but with a spirit of cooperation and dedication, this group rebuilt their television infrastructure, and it's amazing they were able to accomplish so much in just a few short years. And I want to thank Steve McBoy for the opportunity to tell some of their story, and thank you for listening. Sure, if I have time.
Any questions?
I don't know if I can answer them. I pretty much gave it all out there. Yeah.
It's interesting, though, they made so much of restoring it, and they aired it once for the 60th anniversary, and we had to pull teeth to get a copy of the entire 7-hour broadcast.
Right.
They're not, BBC is not making it available themselves.
No,
we had to,
it's our queen.
And the other interesting thing is comparing this coverage with their 1937 television coverage, where we only have still pictures of it. We don't have the video of it. But the only thing that they did on television was the recessional parade.
Right. They wouldn't let them in the Westminster Abbey. Yeah, they had to, in later inventions that I listened to, Peter Dimick says that, they had to fight through the press in order to get access to Westminster Abbey at all. And it had to go through Churchill and the Queen's mother and all sorts of things. But the Queen and Prince Philip were definitely behind it, though. They were 100% in favor of it. And that was part of the reason why they got in.
I must have bought the last available copy of the year that made the day.
Oh, you're the one.
I could buy a copy of it 2 years ago.
So.
I remember hearing the shortwave broadcast of the Coronation when I was about 15 years old. And I remember that NBC, we didn't have television then.
Yeah.
I remember that NBC had tried desperately to pick up the broadcasts from the BBC in this country. They failed because it just didn't work that way.
There was an article in, I think it was in Broadcasting Magazine, the LA Times, that New York Times, forgive me. They had geared up their listening posts out on Long Island, that on the off chance that sometimes television broadcasts come through on a skip, and they were going to try to record that, and they actually had a helicopter standing by and had a telecine set up at Long Island just in case that came through. They were adamant they were going to be first, and they didn't make it.
I saw the photograph of the antennas,
Yeah,
phase
yeah.
at England, it didn't work.
Yeah. But they tried. Yeah.
You mentioned
They're-
through Europe that the standard changed as it went to different countries. How did they accomplish this?
Well, when they sent it to Paris, it was just the 819 line system. So Paris had a converter there to take 405 to 819 line. Well, I haven't discovered that one yet. But and then also when it up to the Wuppertal and the Breda, they converted to 625 there. And of course, once it was in 625, converting it for Germans, it was easy. They just set it on.
625 conversion was optical, but 819 is just line doubling, 405 times.
Yeah. Way back in the back.
Yeah, are you aware that CBS television aired highlights from the coronation on the same day it happened?
That's right. They were the only ones that actually succeeded with that great airplane race.
Very interesting article written by Dick O'Brien, who was the retired director of engineering at CBS television. As a young engineer, he was given the assignment to do this. And of course, there were no satellites, there was no transatlantic fiber,
Yep.
we did not even have transatlantic telephone quality cables. The telephone calls had to come by diversity HF radio. But he worked out a way of doing this. And it's quite remarkable. If you want to read this, he published a very lengthy account in the January 2004 issue of the Journal of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. I had several conversations with Dick about this. It's a very interesting article. You don't have time to go into it now, but again,
I'd love to read it because I haven't been able to get a hold of a copy of it yet.
Grab it out of the hat. 60 odd years ago, without satellite, without fiber.
Right.
ABC was the first one to carry it, because the film was developing a plane coming over, and they tapped Canada's network.
Well, they tapped the Canada network at Montreal. They had a jet waiting at Glacier Bay, I think it was, and another jet flew it to Montreal, which is where it went into the Canadian feed. ABC lifted it, I think at Quebec, lifted it and brought it over to this Quebec to Buffalo, and sent it on the network. And that was the feed that NBC ultimately jumped on because they couldn't get their airplane wasn't going to make it, and that's why CBS ended up being first with it.
CBS actually did kinescope recording at Heathrow. They had a film processor there.
Yeah.
As soon as the last reel of film came off from the BBC off air, it was dry, it went in a Constellation, 4-engine Constellation. There were no jet aircraft there, and most of the seats had been removed. There were 5 flatbed editing stations.
Well, that was for the evening broadcast.
That's how the film was cut as they were traveling over the Atlantic. The plane landed at Logan International. That was at the furthest east point that could feed the CBS network.
Yeah.
And they got on the air with it the same day.
Yeah. Yeah, Sig Nicholson was very proud of that, as you can read in his book. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, a very important day in television history. I remember my mother-in-law and father-in-law bought a television set specifically because they wanted to see that event, and they had to put up a giant antenna. They were in a fringe area, so it was really quite an exciting thing when that happened. So our next speaker this afternoon is Carl Dole, and his topic is Charles Francis Jenkins, a closer look at his life and contribution to early television. Carl is a senior product development engineer at Belden, and I have to say I love Belden's hookup wire, so it's great stuff. He's worked extensively to tell the story of Francis Jenkins from the basement of the Wayne County Historical Museum in Richmond, Indiana, where quite a bit of Jenkins stuff ended up. He was instrumental in bringing Jenkins artifacts to public displays at the SMPTE Centennial in 2016 for the first time after many decades in storage. Carl's interest in electronics also began at an early age, like many of us, with amateur radio and taking apart old black and white televisions to get parts for other electronics projects. That sounds familiar. His interest in electronics led him into a career in broadcast engineering for television and radio prior to joining Belden. He enjoys staying in touch with the broadcast industry and keeps that as part of his daily work at Belden. Has a bachelor's degree from Purdue and a master's degree from Indiana Wesleyan University. And we appreciate very much him being here today to share stories about Jenkins with us. So please welcome Carl. Yeah, this is for the video. Just pin it on your shirt somewhere there.
All right. All right, well, thank you very much for bringing me back again. Second annual presentation. This may become an every year event. But I enjoy talking about Jenkins. It's a very interesting story. Last year, I did my first presentation, which focused a lot on the process of bringing these Jenkins artifacts out of the basement of the Wayne County Historical Museum in Richmond, Indiana, and basically making it into a quote-unquote road show. It was quite a process of taking these artifacts, and you think, oh, it's just a simple process, we'll ship them out there to Hollywood, California for the centennial event, and easy process. Well, it was a lot more difficult than anticipated. It took a lot more than just me to make it all happen. But if you remember from last year, the presidential motorcade was like our final obstacle in getting this in. Remember that? Trying to get these objects delivered. So, there it works. Francis Jenkins, very distinguished individual. Don't hear about him much. You hear about a lot of other people, but he's kind of like an inventor that kind of time forgot. Kind of got overpassed by other more famous people. Television didn't really take off till after he passed, so he didn't really get as much recognition probably as he should. But he's an important contributor to motion picture and the television industries. Born north of Dayton, Ohio, grew up in Wayne County, Indiana, attended Earlham College, still in Richmond. Quaker backgrounds, wrote several books. Boyhood of an inventor, wrote a book about radio vision, which we'll talk about today. Very much an inventor. He was the founder and first president of SMPE, Society of Motion Picture Engineers, which later became SMPTE with television added. Some of his contributions, included, it is touchy, like you say. The Fantascope, which was a motion picture projector, so he's credited with inventing motion picture projection. He did high-speed photography, which was important, of real interest to the manufacturing industry, because you take a machine and see what's happening in slow motion. Facsimile, his interest in photography and pictures extended into sending pictures out over the airwaves. His most successful thing was the paper milk bottle. Came at a good time because there was concern about sanitation of the way milk was handled at the time. So he invented this paper milk bottle. It was kind of like, the oatmeal box that has spiral wrapped layers of cardboard or thin paper. So he made the disposable milk bottle. So I kind of credit him with creating all this problem with all the disposable containers we have now. All these cans and water bottles we have to deal with. He started that. I don't know, but I'll give him credit for that. But he was very successful. He sold that because he was more interested in other things. Sold that business, used the money, and kind of like we would do. We'd sell something important that was making money to support our habit of, doing electronic things. So, but the thing I want to focus on today was this television, radio vision, which is kind of an optical mechanical system. But he was very much an inventor, 283 patents, but how many people have heard of him? So yeah, we did the SMPTE Centennial in 2006. had the museum with 5 of the artifacts from the museum. Only one of those was actually on public display prior to this. So this was really the first public presentation of most of these artifacts for many decades. They had sat in the museum basement for many years. When Jenkins passed away, his widow had this stuff. I'm sure, like we have stuff that our wives would love to get rid of. So she decided, because he had roots in Richmond, that she would donate this to the Wayne County Museum. So it sat in the museum basement for many, many years until we finally, through Belden's help and many others, had these cases constructed. You see these nice, this is the laser point, these nice display cases. They're really road cases underneath there. And the base of the road case has wheels, sets on top of the cover, and makes a nice display case, so we can convert them from road cases to display cases. Those are actually made by Whirlwind up in New York State. And so they worked out really well, and we had all that made and got those on display. And as you can see here, these are the television artifacts we're going to focus on today. And here's the receiver on the left and the television display on the right as part of the display that's now public in the Wayne County Museum. So another artifact that still exists is the Jenkins Jewelry Building. It's no longer a jewelry, but this was a relative of Charles Francis Jenkins. This building still stands on Main Street in Richmond, Indiana, and there is a plaque, as you can see down there on the right, which says, says, "To the memory of C. Francis Jenkins, inventor of the original motion picture machine, who projected the first moving picture ever shown in Richmond in this building." And it was, movies were controversial from the beginning. I read that he showed this film of a woman dancing, and the audience was a little bit disturbed by it because they were able to see her ankles. So, film's been controversial from the beginning. This is a photograph, probably, I don't know when or where, but I think it's probably taken in his lab, and these are some of the people that worked for him. Of course, you see Jenkins here, front right. I saw a picture in a book, a biography about Jenkins by Godfrey, and a lot of these people look familiar, so I think that's probably some of his lab staff. But just looking at that picture, you get kind of a sense of the type of people, the distinguished people they were, and the real thinking people, and you look at the things on the wall, kind of give a sense of what type of environment they were operating in. And Jenkins was a real breadboarder. He liked to tinker and make things. You can see in this lower photograph, all this exposed stuff, definitely wouldn't pass our, I won't even go into that. We just had a new rule at our place we work about razor blades. Okay, we work with wire cable, and anyway. New rules about razor blades. Anybody worked with, wire and cable, you got to use some cutting tools to work with it. So, but here he is with these, vacuum tubes, wires, who knows what else. He just tinkering away. That was him. Liked to breadboard, liked to make stuff. So sending images by radio. He developed a thing kind of like a fax machine to send weather maps to ships, which was important for the Navy. And the U.S. Navy said, hey, this is a great idea. And as you can kind of see, it looks like a rotating drum, some mechanism here, and a movable pin. So you get XY movement, and you can send a map by radio. And as you can see here, here's an example of an image sent. You can see the Florida sticking down here, the east coast of the U.S. Up here it says U.S. Department of, that actually says U.S. Department of Agriculture. So, I guess they're concerned about weather too, August of, I think that's 20-something, 26, 28, or something like that. So he was into sending images by the airwaves, which then led into television, the next step in radio development. So he was really forward thinking, and shows here in this caption, this illustration shows C. Francis Jenkins, the father of the present motion picture industry, and his lens scanner for the broadcast of radio movies, another terminology. One of the things I noticed in preparing this presentation is the use of terminology. It's like, okay, people know what radio is, but if you use the word television, they may not understand. So you kind of modify the word and call it radio vision. Oh, it's radio with sending images by radio. So kind of like with the telegraph. I saw the word, the terminology radio-telegraph in some of my readings. So they took radio-telegraph. Okay, we send telegraph by wires. Oh, now we're going to send it by radio. So kind of modify the term in a way that people can understand it. Inventor predicts television in every home in a decade. Now, this guy was really forward-thinking, but a little ahead of his time. You know, it's kind of like I think about when broadcast television went from analog to digital. You know, and there's prediction. I think the original deadline was like 2006 or something like that. 2006, we got delayed, you know, and everything takes a little longer than you think, you know. So, you know, same thing here. Television didn't happen overnight like he was thinking. A television in every home in a decade. That's a lot of televisions. But that was his vision. And the way these articles are written is real interesting. So if you look at them, you know, we're used to reading articles that are kind of just real straightforward, but the people who wrote these articles were a little more creative in their writing style. Like, you know, down here at the bottom, it says, you know, well, son, you know, Jenkins said, you asked me for a message to your high school students, A. What do you think I could tell them? A little bit different style here. So that was his prediction. And then another article. And the thing to note about, one thing I want to mention about these clippings here I'm showing is this was taken out of the Wayne County Historical Museum. And part of the collection, when Jenkins passed away and his wife, you know, donated this museum, was scrapbooks. And basically, it looks like what Jenkins did was he collected newspaper clippings and put them in these scrapbooks and saved them. And that's why we have all this stuff. So, you know, here's another, he's saying, foretells brilliant future for radio films, you know, sending films by radio. So here's an example of an early Jenkins television called a radio visor, which shows pictures about 6 by 6 inches. Who needs a 72-inch widescreen TV? All you need is 6 by 6 inches. And it's for the whole family. So all you need is 6 by 6. The whole family can watch it. So I figured either they had really good eyesight or they like to get really close together and watch this. So, but this was an example of an early. And one of the things I found about this in doing all the studies, it sounds like what this was a scanning drum type of system, whereas the one that's in the Wayne County Museum is a disc. So there's a lot of stuff about Jenkins that I think is, there seem to be a lot of gaps in the story. We get little glimpses of it. Here's an example. Here's another picture of the radio visor next to a standard radio set. This is a standard radio set here. A lot different than the radios we're used to seeing today. So you got a receiver. What do you got? How many stations you got to, you know, watch? You know, I grew up in a time where we had 4 stations. 4 VHF stations is all we could get. That was it. No cable TV, no satellite. So here's what we had available back in the early days. Call letters, you see, these are all amateur radio. For those of you familiar with amateur radio, you know, formatting a call letter is like a W with a letter. And these were experimental stations. That was another interesting thing. They were given experimental license. They could not do anything commercial with them. So Jenkins had to operate his stations, like the others, as non-commercial, but he was trying to sell the radios, the receivers, as the way to make money. So yeah, free broadcasting, but to make the money through the radios, since you don't have any commercials. So we got three right at the top of the list: Jenkins Laboratory, Wheaton, Maryland. Then there's one New York City, and then there's a portable one. They're all operating below 3 megahertz. So these are really just shortwave broadcast stations. These are not up in the VHF, UHF like we're used to. These are shortwave broadcast stations sending out signals, video signals. And another thing to notice is the power, 5,000, except for GE and Westinghouse. I guess they're into the, we want more power, so they went 20 kilowatts. And we're a whole 60 lines per frame or less. 60 or less. Oh yeah, and head under Light Purdue, got one of my degrees from there. So in this process of early television, the need to have standards became apparent. And again, Jenkins is involved in this. The Radio Radio Manufacturers Association put together a television committee to look into, try to develop some standards. And what came out of it was a 48-line standard. And what's interesting to note here, we got a little bit of displacement there of the underlying, but anyway, let's see. 48 lines with 15 frames or pictures every second. And I don't know why. It somehow displaced the underlining, but down here, it's what's supposed to be underlined, is the committee adopted a standard system used by C. Francis Jenkins. So they adopted Jenkins' standard. And they developed the scanning left to right, top to bottom, like NTSC. And they also adopted the use of the word frame. So to indicate, like we think of one frame. So some of the terminology in scanning, technique got established very early on and carried forward into NTSC and whatever else came later before that. So this, if you think back to if we go back to I'll go back here real quick to the list, the top of the list, W3XK is shown here in this picture. This was his station in Wheaton, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C. And what's interesting, there's a house and 2 towers. And when I first saw those towers, I thought, man, those look really tall. I was thinking, man, they're like maybe 150 foot tall or something. But I did read in the biography of Jenkins that they were only 60 feet tall. So I think they look so tall probably because Jenkins was probably flying and flew real low to get a good picture of this. So it says they're only 60 feet tall. I suspect that there was probably just like a wire, and again, this is shortwave, so think amateur radio, HF, probably strung a wire between them, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just had a single wire coming down, not even a coax, kind of a T configuration, had a tuner inside there, and the transmitter. And this was the broadcast station. The station went on the air in the spring of 1929. That was the second station, went on the spring of 29 on the roof of the Jenkins plant. This one went on about the same time and operated for a number of years. Unfortunately, this was all just a few months before the big thing that happened in October of 29, which started the Great Depression. And so right at the time this was all getting ready to take off for Jenkins and the others that were looking at television, depression hit. And so it was a short order before Jenkins and things got sold to others and ended up in the hands through some DeForest and Dumont, whatever, talking about lawsuits and the St. Louis thing, some of that going on. So ended up in the hands of Sarnoff, and of course he said, well, we're just going to crush all this and we'll go ahead, and so a lot of stuff probably was lost and things shut down. But this station did operate for several years. So what could you watch? Again, looking here at the bottom, it talks about the 3 X-ray kilo station from Jenkins. Now here it mentions operating at higher frequencies in the shortwave range, up above 6 megacycles. And here it mentions, again, the standard, 48 lines, 15 frames, top to bottom. Talks here about an experimental station, 5,000 watts. So there were some things happening, operating commercially. Experimentally, they couldn't operate commercially. Another movie sent via radio. And this was, had some interesting information in it. It mentions about the broadcasting of motion pictures that have been made possible by the use of a prismatic lens. So, and then it mentions the prismatic lenses rings, which are protected by patents. And we'll see here in a little bit, the actual ring, which is the type of projector that's in the Wayne County Museum, where it has lenses embedded into a ring. In fact, I'll just go ahead here real quick like that. So we have these little prismatic lenses mounted into this ring. Go back here. And then it says, electromagnetic or wireless waves are susceptible to the impression of picture characteristics, which we would call modulation, just as at present electrical waves may be translated into speech if voice characteristics are impressed upon thereon. Fancy way of saying modulating the signal. And then it also goes on to talk about the warped contour of this ring of transparent substance. When rotated across the beam of light, there is a constant change in its refracting angle, which is how they got the scanning to happen. And then it mentions a light valve, a gas tube filled with carbon bisulfate, and that was the light source. So here we have this picture I've seen for several years. On the left is the receiver, and the right's the display, like the ones in the Wayne County Museum. And I was just looking at it this week, and I was looking at the background, and you can kind of see back here, it looks like there's chairs, kind of envision where this was picture was taken. And I started thinking, and I started looking at the front of these. And then I looked at the picture of the one out of the Wayne County Museum. And I started looking at the detail. And these are made out of real wood. So it's not like, you make a fake, wood veneer and, stamp it out and, have 1,000 all look the same. So every piece of wood that's cut is going to have a unique feature to it. So I started looking at some of the unique features there and realized that the unique pattern of the wood in here actually matches this one here. So this picture is actually of the unit that's actually in the Wayne County Museum. I did the same thing on the receiver and found the same match. So for several years I was looking at these are just examples of what's in the museum, but these are actually what is in the Wayne County Museum. I actually looked at the picture of the receiver that's in the museum here, and it doesn't match. But definitely, like you can see this dark spot here and some of these other details down in here, this grain pattern, it matches what's in the Wayne County Museum. So I'm beginning to think, I wonder if these are the ones that were in Jenkins' home or his lab, his personal ones that he used to watch his broadcast. And then he ended up, they were in his home and got donated by his wife, his widow, when he passed away. So that was an interesting discovery. It's kind of like something right in front of you for years and years, and you finally realize, realize something you didn't know about it. Here's the display with the, I call this the horizontal hold control. And what all it does is rotates the motor to help synchronize the image. And this is the spinning disc with the prisms mounted on it. You have the crater lamps, the light source. The light goes through each lens, and you notice they're in a spiral, so they displace a little bit. So I'm kind of envisioning what's happening here is as one lens moves across here, the light beam is deflected, bent, and causes it to scan across the mirror. And then it bounces off the mirror to this translucent display to see it on the front of the display. And there are 60 lenses, I've counted them, there's 60 there. So, and here's a picture of a patent related to that. Jenkins patented it. So then, okay, so we have, looks like we apparently had 60 lines, because there's 60 prismatic lenses. So you'd have 60 lines per frame. Power line frequency is 60. What I don't know, and I haven't found yet, is how fast did this rotate and what would have been the frame rate of this motor. I have wanted to plug this thing in, and because it runs on 120 volt AC, and so far I haven't gotten permission, but I might do it anyway. Like put a variable auto transform on it, bring it up slowly, or do some preliminary tests on it, and see what we can accomplish there. And what I'd really like to do is make this thing actually work. So, still more missing pieces of the puzzle. Another thing he did, I found this, was he developed a photo sensing device, 2,304 tiny photosensitive cells, mounted on a 2 foot by 2 foot board, kind of basically like a camera. I guess this was trying to make a camera. And this is actually mentioned, 2 foot square, 2,304 tiny lens sensitive cells. So he's trying to make a camera to pick up an image. So there's a whole other area to investigate. Here's television at the Hoover inauguration, and I did read that they actually did broadcast this event to their audience. And I thought, oh wow, live pictures, live like the Queen coronation, all that going on. And then I read a little further and I realized my perception of what was possible then did not agree with what's possible now. I was thinking, oh yeah, you have a camera set up, you broadcast it live. Well, no, they didn't have the technology to do that. So what I found out is it was on a 30-minute delay. What they did was they took pictures and had to run them to the station and somehow put them on the air. So it was more like a slideshow than a live broadcast, like I would think of. So anyway, the station, like I mentioned before, it did close about 1933, W3XK, and things kind of went downhill in 1929 for the whole Jenkins enterprise. But he did a lot and contributed a lot. The more I study about Jenkins, the more I learned that there's more to learn about Jenkins. So, again, thanks to the Early Television Museum for inviting me to come and present again, and also to Belden for their contribution in bringing this Jenkins history to life. Livingston Sound. Hugh Livingston did the Centennial Museum back in 2016, and also the Wayne County Museum for their part in preserving these artifacts. And Jim Harlan, who I worked with extensively on this project, retired. So he's now retired after this all happened. And last but not least, obviously, Mr. Jenkins. Thanks for his contribution to early television. Thank you. I was hoping to have some extra time to give it to Mr. O'Neill, but this thing, I get excited about this and start reading, talking about it. I would say one more thing. If you're interested in learning more about Jenkins, Donald Godfrey wrote this a few years ago. C. Francis Jenkins, pioneer of film and television. A lot of good information in there. So I used him as a big source. Yes?
A few decades ago, back in the 70s, there was an article about Jenkins in the TV Guide.
Oh, really? Okay.
And it pictured a set.
Uh-huh.
Radio visor.
Oh, really? Okay.
2 weeks after that article went out, I visited Jack Popley. He was the Voice of America engineer, and he had been the person who in the 1920s was WR's chief engineer. That set was in his office.
Oh, okay.
There was a plaque underneath the picture, like about a 3x4 plaque, that was presented to Lee DeForest,
Okay.
who gave that set to Jack Popley. There's a picture in the Wayne County Museum that you showed there of a radio visor with a plaque underneath the picture. Do you know if that is that set?
Oh. No, I don't think so. I think I know what you're talking about. This is, let me get back there real quick. No, I think,
Yeah, there.
okay. That is something that was created for these display units, so that's a modern. That's actually part of the display case and not part of the artifact. It just describes what it is, so if somebody walks up, they can read that and know what it is. But yeah, all right.
Because I've been wondering what happened to that. I once met Jack's
Yeah.
brother, and I forgot to ask him if he had the set that was in Jack's office.
Yeah, I think DeForest may have actually worked for Jenkins.
I think that DeForest took over the Jenkins.
That's right. It was that. Yeah. Yeah.
At least that's what Jack Popley had told me.
I know in the process of things unwinding, DeForest and Dumont, and then Sarnoff got involved in it, and it kind of ended up in Sarnoff's hand in the end. So things kind of devolved that way. So thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah. Right here, I can get it. There you go.
Get that too.
All right.
Okay, we have another fine presentation this afternoon as our wind-up presentation by James O'Neill. The topic is celebrating television's longest remote, the July 1969 Apollo 11 broadcast from the moon. So James O'Neill is a good friend and a great guy. He's been involved in broadcasting for more than a half a century. Part-time employment at his hometown radio station during his high school years, and then continuing on with radio and television operations throughout his high school and college years. He was a graduate of the University of Arkansas, and he then went forward with a full-time broadcast engineering career spanning nearly 37 years. And following his retirement from broadcast engineering in 2005, James began a second career in writing and publishing, which he's still deeply involved in today. He served for about 10 years as technology editor at TV Technology magazine and is now a technical consultant to that magazine. He's a frequent contributor to TV Technology as well as its sister publication Radio World and a number of others. He serves as an editor-in-chief of an IEEE broadcast sector publication and is an associate editor at the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers Journal. He's a life fellow of the SMPTE and a life member of the IEEE and the Society of Broadcasting Engineers. He's also been very much involved in this museum here in Hilliard, and he's also served on the board of directors of the National Capital Radio and Television Museum in Maryland, which I'm also associated with. So please welcome James O'Neill.
I'll trade you. Hey, Brian, thanks for that very nice introduction. Really appreciate it. Hope I live up to it. I will preface my presentation by saying this almost didn't happen because as Dave Arlen back there, Wayne down here, George Lemaster, several others who are very much involved in broadcasting know, in every April there's this big pilgrimage out to the high desert. I'm talking about Las Vegas, Nevada, for something called the National Association of Broadcasters show. They don't like to say convention, they call it the NAB show.
And this takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. This year, I think I was out there with something like 91,400 of my closest friends. It's a week of total sleep deprivation. You're running literally from one end of this gigantic 3 million square foot convention center to the other. And when I get home, it's not over at all. I got home late on Friday the 12th. It was another week and a half of writing, editing pictures, getting copy in, not only for TV technology, but also for the IEEE publication that Brian mentioned, because I was holding that issue open to get NAB coverage in. My wife knows very well, long-suffering wife back there, Pam, knows very well that I'm not a very fun person to be with right after NAB. So this almost didn't happen, but I got to thinking, gee, it's been 50 years, half a century, since the biggest, and I've got to say this, the biggest television event on this planet probably from time on took place. And that is the July 20th coverage of the soft landing of Apollo 11 on the moon. And then about 4 hours later, the transmission of television pictures back from the surface of the moon, literally all over the world. And I really figured that couldn't pass into oblivion without some sort of notification. The next significant anniversary, maybe 75 years, maybe 100 years from now, the rigors of time will probably have taken its toll on me and you both. We won't be around to hear what I'm going to say and look at some of the pictures. That said, let me go ahead and start. And by the way, I've got to make another qualifier here. We had some computer problems. Life was so much simpler when you were doing presentations in the days of the Kodak carousel projector and also the analog tape recorder where you actually could hold up something physically and put it on and hit the button and it would play. So we're doing now what, if you've worked in motion picture film production, is called a double system. The picture is on one film, the audio is on another film, or maybe television, split sound versus intercarrier. You've got two different ways for things to travel. Anyway, the pictures are on one computer, the sound is on the other, and I hope we're going to get all this synced together. I'm starting out here with this quote attributed to the late Hunter Thompson, this gonzo journalist back in the 70s, 80s. And it's one I kind of like. I think anybody who's worked in television, no matter which end, the production side, selling commercials, engineering, keeping stations on the air, know there's a lot of truth here. And I also found out there's a corollary to this. Somebody added, there's also a negative side. I'll let you think about that. I mean, television, once in a great while, television rises above this. I'm also reminded, too, of a letter to Dear Abby some years ago. It began, Dear Abby, said, my father is in a state prison serving a 20-year life term for armed robbery and manslaughter. My mother is a hopeless alcoholic. My sister makes a living as a prostitute. My younger brother has been in an institution for the criminally insane since his teen years. Abby, recently I met the girl of my dreams, a young woman who I think I want to spend the rest of my life with. Do you think it might endanger our relationship if I tell her I work in television? But again, once in a great while, television rises above this reputation, and I certainly think it did in July of 1969. So I want to share a little bit of this with you and explain, my particular interest in this. In July of 69, I had been a college graduate for not quite 2 months. The ink on my diploma was still wet. I was working full-time by then at an NBC affiliate in my college town and getting ready to go back and do some part-time graduate work. And this happened on a Sunday, this landing on the moon in the video. And I was fortunate enough, I guess, to be at home watching this more or less undisturbed by the goings-on at the TV station there. And I went the wrong way here. So let's get started with this thing. As I say, this was one of television's great shining moments. This broadcast from the moon. And let's see. Okay, here we go. I'm going to play just a little bit of this, just to set the stage. All of you who saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was released in the cinema a year before this happened, that was 2008. But some of the music, the way the thing began. So we're on the moon for the first time ever with live human beings moving around. and we're getting television pictures back. The longest remote in television history, literally from two fronts. The moon was about 239,000 miles away from Earth at that point in its orbit. And also this remote ran off and on from launch on July the 16th to splashdown on July 24th. That's 8-9 days or so. It was not continuous. But believe me, on that Sunday going into the Monday, when we had people on the moon, they were there for about 21, 22 hours. Everybody in the world was watching this, literally. This was the biggest television audience in history. This is a couple of quotes from Broadcasting Magazine, a remote that broke all records, the biggest show in broadcast history. It involved an expenditure by the networks of around $11 million. In today's money, that's over $70 million. That's in lost revenue because they canceled a lot of shows, they canceled advertisements to do continuous coverage of this great landmark space event. It took about 1,000 people, Broadcasting Magazine's writers estimated, to put this all together. I don't doubt it. I would even have to think there were more involved based on the technology that we were working around then to make this transmission happen. And it was also, I find this very interesting too, the last bullet I've got, it was record use of commercial satellite time. This is from Intelsat. The previous record had been set the October before in '68 when the networks here transmitted the Summer Olympics from Mexico City. That was about 225 hours. Now I've got to remind you too, this is from Intelsat, not domestic satellites. We really didn't do much at that time with domestic satellite. Most of the connectivity for video and audio was handled by AT&T long lines through microwave circuits and coax. But we did, because of the global nature of this event, in pulling down these signals from the moon at various points on the Earth at these tracking stations, and also the dissemination of video around the world, it did involve a heck of a lot of satellite time. And I would hate to see the bill for that. Again, about 125 to 150 million people in the US watched this, and an estimated 500 million people around the world saw the same broadcast. Interestingly enough, we were not on good terms with the Russians, with the Soviets. This was the heart of the Cold War. I befriended, or he befriended me, an immigrant from the Soviet Union who had worked at the Moscow Telecenter. And he said, we pirated a feed that night, the night of July 20th, from Eurovision and aired it. He said, I couldn't believe this happened in the Soviet Union. We're showing the Soviet people what the Americans are doing. But somebody high up felt we had to do this, so we took the feed from Eurovision and fed the whole Soviet Union. So I guess the only people who probably didn't see this, maybe some of our military people in Vietnam, people who were undergoing surgery at that time, maybe people in airplanes, people locked up in solitary confinement, but I think everybody else who had access to a television set watched this and were glued to the television set. Just by comparison, some other audiences here, I'll let you read this for yourself. I think the nearest thing approaching this was in August of 1974 when Nixon announced he was walking away from the presidency. You don't have me to kick around anymore. But not even close to that 150 million estimated mark in July 20th of 1969. Well, what my interest was in this thing, okay, as Brian said, I had retired from engineering after 37 years. In 2005, I immediately started a second career as technology editor with TV Technology magazine. My boss asked me every year I was there, is there something significant that you know about, knowing my interest in history, in broadcasting that we should be writing about, some sort of historical perspective? And I said, yeah, you can't miss, this was 2009, I said, you can't miss the very, very earth-shattering event of getting video back, live video back from the moon in July of the Apollo 11 mission. So I ended up publishing 3 separate articles in TV Technology over the summer, as well as a couple more in our sister publication then, Government Video. As part of my research, I was sent to a number of press events which celebrated the 40th anniversary of the event. This is at the museum in Washington, and we had the 3 astronauts. We had, of course, Neil Armstrong, who was first to set foot on the moon, Edwin Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, who was in the command ship orbiting the moon while the other two were down in the lunar module. They were there, a number of dignitaries. I got to attend this press conference, several others. And I also got to meet Dick Knapsinger, it's a little bit hard to say at the end of the day, and Stan LeBar. Dick was still a NASA employee. He was hired in the early 60s. He explained to me he was the first person to be hired to do video for NASA when they realized they were going to launch on this Apollo program. It didn't end with Apollo 11. And they were going to need some live video from space. And they had nobody who was trained in video. He had worked at a television station in Florida when he was brought on payroll. At this time, in 2009, I think he was very near, or surpassed probably, no, I guess he was nearing his 50th year of working for the federal government, which has to be a record unto itself, working at NASA. Stan LeBar was living in suburban Baltimore. He was the project manager at Westinghouse who oversaw the development of two cameras, very specialized cameras, for use on the moon. I'm going to talk more about this later. But I got to spend some time with Stan and also some time with Dick, who showed me through part of the Goddard facility there in Maryland. I do want some audio here, if you could play this along and let you read, and maybe you've heard this before. That was President Kennedy. That recording was not taken from his address to the U.S. Senate and House, but to an audience in Houston. But again, the same message. We want to get a man on the moon and return him safely before the end of this decade, the 1960s. And we had a lot of incentive for doing this. We literally got caught with our pants down in October of 1957 when the Russians launched Sputnik on October 4th. We tried to get a space program going. We again got trumped really badly in April of 1961 when the Soviets put Yuri Gagarin up, the first man to be launched into space and returned again alive. There was a dog which didn't return before, that was Laika, if you remember that. Okay, so we had to do this basically to save face. And a lot of good things came out of it too. This was a very expensive program, the Apollo program, which, the Apollo program leading up to Apollo 11 and concluding with Apollo 17 in 1972. That was a lunar mission. But the government spent something like $25.4 billion. That's around, if you do a calculate for inflation, adjust for that, that's about $175 billion today. That's a lot of money. That's a tremendous amount of money. But no holes were barred, no expense was spared. We want to get a man on the moon and return him safely before the end of the decade. Okay, there was a video, as I said, planned early on in the program. And that's why they brought Dick Knapsinger on board at NASA. Now, Apollo 7 was the first mission to fly with a video camera. RCA and GE were the mainstream video camera, professional television studio camera providers in the 60s. You had a lot of small players, Dage, Bell and Howell even, Sarkis Tarzayan, and you had some good cameras that were made in outside of the U.S. I'm speaking of Marconi and also the Philips people, Norelco. But again, those cameras were not U.S. made. In the space program, we're not going to put anything, in orbit that was not made here in the U.S. But again, GE, RCA were the main players in television cameras. How did Westinghouse and Stan LeBar get involved in this? Well, Westinghouse, basically known for a company making consumer electronic goods. Nobody, I don't think, has ever seen a Westinghouse studio television camera. Am I wrong? Anybody can prove me wrong? I certainly know of nothing like this. So how did they get tapped for this very, very important part of the mission? Here's some of the requirements for the camera. Well, like I say, RCA and Westinghouse were awarded almost simultaneously contracts to build cameras. And RCA did have the first camera to go on board the Apollo 7. That was the first mission to fly with video. And by the way, 7 only flew a low Earth orbit mission. They did not go to the moon. The RCA camera used a Vidicon. It was a slow scan camera, as was the Westinghouse black and white camera, because the mission was not really planned initially for video. Knapsinger, some others found a small hole in the telemetry voice data S-band signals that were coming back from the spacecraft that could be made available if they moved some things around and did some filtering for some fairly narrow video. We're talking 0.5 megahertz, which is much less even than the Brits did with 40550. So the standard that looked like it was going to work the best was 320 lines at 10 frames per second. Very, very, very slow frame repetition rate, but it was figured you're not going to be covering football, tennis, somebody pirouetting around doing ballet. These are people who have very heavy, bulky spacesuits. They're not going to be moving very fast, so 10 frames a second will probably work. And also 320 lines is going to make a fairly decent picture. Again, you still have to fit through this little tiny 500,000 hertz knothole. So those were the standards that were set. And I mentioned the RCA camera didn't perform very well. It was a Vidicon camera. It had a lot of lag problems. It's a photoresistive type of pickup tube. It didn't have a lot of light sensitivity. There was no gain like an image orthicon, no multiplier stage. And the camera could not handle a very large dynamic range. We talk a lot about HDR right now. The Vidicon is fairly limited in what it could do. Westinghouse had several trump cards up its sleeve. First of all, they had several very big military contracts. Also, they had an aerospace division outside Baltimore where Stan LeBar worked. They had an electron tube division in Elmira, New York, which made some very interesting tubes, just which I happen to have one here. This is a fairly rare tube. Anybody ever see something like this? This is an SEC tube, secondary electron conduction tube. It's something like a Vidicon, but it ain't. Cutaway sketch of the tube, and here's a chart. You can follow through on this. Let's see if this laser pointer is going to work. Again, you've got an interesting faceplate. This is made out of fiber optic material. The tube is electrostatically deflected. You could make it otherwise. It's magnetically deflected. What happened? We lost everything? Okay. Can we start again with, there, okay. And go full screen? Okay. Thanks for standing by. The tube is very interesting. In the center of the tube, I did that. Hit the wrong button. No. I'm sorry. Can we go back? Okay, in the center of the tube, you've got your photocathode, which is converting light into electrons, and they're deflected back here to this target area. You've got some very, very, very thin layers of metal there. You have aluminum oxide, not really metal. Then you have metallic aluminum. Then you have potassium chloride. These layers, believe me, are fractions of a micron thick, the first two layers. The electrons go back. They hit I'm going to make sure I got the right button this time. They hit the layer back here, the potassium chloride, and they knock off secondary electrons. And these go back to the target in the middle, the solid aluminum there, which is very porous, because otherwise you couldn't pass anything through it. And they're scanned off like in a Vidicon with a scanning beam. Well, you get a gain of something like 30 to 100 times because of these secondary electrons. That's all I'm going to say about the tube. I don't have a lot of time here, and I've eaten up a lot of it. Anyway, here's some of the characteristics. The tube has extremely low lag, nothing like a Vidicon. It doesn't smear. Very high sensitivity because of these secondary electrons and this multiplication. And it can operate over a range, incredible range, of dynamic range of 1/10 of a foot candle up to about 10,000 foot candles. It's fairly small, lightweight. You don't need all the paraphernalia, the circuitry you got in, say, an image orthicon camera. So it was an ideal choice. Well, Westinghouse not only had the tube, but they could fabricate. They had a chip plant, a chip foundry. They could fabricate custom integrated circuits to build the rest of the camera, and they did. So Westinghouse got the nod for the cameras. It became the Westinghouse, the official NASA number, Westinghouse number, is a 607R926. It doesn't roll off the tongue like a GE PE 350 or RCA TK 47, but this is how the camera was known. Very interesting. It's ruggedized. It had to withstand a lot of punishment, of high vacuum. I mean, we're talking something like 10 to the minus 14 torr on the moon, extremely high vacuum. It really didn't have any way to cool itself. You can't really cool something in a vacuum by convection. So the only real control you had on the back of the camera, it wasn't a control, it was an indicator to the astronaut the camera's getting too hot. You need to shut it down. It was a very lightweight camera. That's a very big consideration on a space mission. It weighed only 6.5 pounds on Earth, and it drew a very small amount of power for something like this at the time. It pulled 28 volts, nominally 28 volts, and drew only 6.25 watts. So it was an ideal camera for the mission. Westinghouse built 17 of these. I'm going to put this tube back before I do something stupid like drop it, and it is a pretty rare bird. They built 17 under a NASA contract. 7.7 million, that's about $53 million in today's money. If you divide this by 17, each camera cost the government about $453,000, or about 3.1 million today. 7 were used in test simulations, training, never went into space. 10 did go into space. And interestingly enough, the Apollo 11 camera was left behind on the moon. If you ever get up there, you might want to think about salvage. They left a lot of very interesting things up there, and because they were trying to minimize the amount of fuel they need to get this thing off. I mentioned too, there was a camera on Apollo 8 and 10. I didn't say that. They did fly lunar orbits. They went around the moon. Apollo 10 flew in May of 1969, sort of setting the stage for the July Apollo 11. Purposefully, NASA restricted the amount of fuel in the lunar module because they did not want the astronauts to go ahead and jump the gun and land the Apollo 10, beat the Apollo 11, the planned landing. So there was not enough fuel. The astronauts knew there's not enough fuel. If they did decide to break the orders, rules, and land, they could not get back off the moon. So that was a great incentive for staying in orbit. Okay, Stan LeBar found out something very interesting too. The crew, as I mentioned, Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong, were selected in November of 1967. LeBar went to several briefings, and when Armstrong found out there was no live video plan from the moon, there was live video plan from the command module, but not from the moon, he said, I refuse to fly the mission. He said, because the Soviets can say, we faked this later, we brought motion picture film home, anybody could, Walt Disney Studios could have done this. It's got to be live or I'm not going to fly the mission. So Stan and Dick Nafziger, others, a lot of others, worked real hard to make this happen. It's much more than a camera. It involved linking this very minute signal they could generate on the moon, cramming this half megahertz video, slow scan video, in between telemetry, voice, other data being transmitted, and getting it back to the Earth, and also being lined up with the right tracking station, and getting this slow scan video somehow converted to 52560 NTSC type video so the networks can use it. And again, the moon and the Earth, the tracking stations had to be in the right place. Well, Westinghouse made everything happen working along with NASA. Here's some data on the camera parameters, as I mentioned. So we had to convert, and this just came up during the Coronation. How did they convert from one standard to another? Well, RCA built some standards converters for the space program. This is the ones that were used. I think they had 2 or 3 of these in operation when the mission was launched. It's basically very similar to an RCA television film recorder, a kinescope machine, which I'm familiar with. You had a camera, TK22, solid state telecine camera, shooting a special cathode ray tube. The cathode ray tube had a long persistence phosphor. It was displaying this 320 line, 10 frame per second video. The camera picked it up, and the camera was being scanned at 52560. Well, that's not really too much of a problem. Here's a block diagram of the thing. But again, you think about this, the NTSC camera is scanning here 52560, let's see, 60, that's 16 and around 16 and 2/3 milliseconds to scan a field. You put two of these together, it takes a little over 33 milliseconds to scan a frame. And you've already, it takes 1/10 of a second, 100 milliseconds, for the slow scan to make a picture. So you're going to get pretty far behind. You're going to get part of one picture carrying over into the other. So RCA came up with a very interesting workaround here. And this was in the era when digital electronics was just getting started good. It was the early dawn. So RCA used the technology at hand. They took a signal from the TK22, 52560, fed it into an interlacer, a switching device. They also took a feed simultaneously and fed a disc recorder. This was something like the Ampex HS100 slow-mo recorder, which could record a television field. It was held up there. Okay, then the sequencer down here, the control logic, said go ahead and pass the first field, the 262.5 lines, and when the time came, we've got this out, we're still scanning back here. You've got a second field, a pseudo-second field, recorded on the disc recorder. We're going to go ahead and play that, but we're going to slow it down to a quartz delay line by, 31 3/4 microseconds, which is about half of a television line, 63.5 for a color television line. So we're going to start it a half line late so we achieve interlace. So we've achieved a pseudo interlace. We've made one frame artificially out of the first, a field out of the first field to create a composite frame. Well, of course, as I say, one system is going on new field every 10 seconds, and the other is or every 1/10 of a second. And the 52560, we're getting a full picture every 33 milliseconds. So you've got to do this 3 times before you've got a full legal, I guess you could call it, 52560 signal. This is how the standards converter worked. We have at least one person, maybe more in this room, that could build something with today's electronics the size of a cigarette pack that would do the same thing. I do have to mention, and this is part of my presentation, because this is a camera shooting a CRT, you've got some problems. You've got granularity of the phosphor on the CRT. You've got a little curvature in the front of the CRT. You're generating some geometric distortion. And the fact you've got a camera shooting another picture, you're blocking up contrast. You're blocking up the blacks. You're blocking up the whites. So you're going to have some degradation. Okay, moving along just very quickly, and I don't want to run out of time. I'm getting awfully close. The signals were taken down for this video from the moon, which began about 10 o'clock Eastern time, the evening of July 20th, 1969. Goldstone was supposed to take this down. Goldstone's in California, but the walk outside with the camera was not supposed to take place until about 2 in the morning Eastern time, but they went ahead and speeded it up so it took place at about 10 o'clock. So you had Goldstone in acquisition, and you also had a couple of stations in Australia that NASA had contracted with, the biggest dish being there at Parkes in New South Wales. That was a very large dish, and all 3 were getting signals. Well, the time came, this explains it a little bit too, I'll let you read that, about the size of the antennas. I'm running out of voice. But this 3 stations were in acquisition of this very, very weak signal from the moon at the time Armstrong came out of the spacecraft. This is the camera mounted on the deck of the lunar module. Just let you see what it looks like. He had to go out and retrieve the camera and pick it up. And here's another picture. You can see a little more detail of the camera up here, and the ladder coming down, which Armstrong descended down to the surface of the moon from. And there's the whole thing. You see the ladder on the other side. Other side, you really can't see it in this picture where the camera was stowed. Okay, back to Stan Lamar. Since he was project manager, it was decided by management, corporate management, upper corporate management in Westinghouse, if this thing failed, the burden was going to be on him. He was going to have to stand up before the cameras in Houston Mission Control and tell the world, this 500 million person audience, that, hey, we screwed up. We're not going to see video from the moon live after all. So can you imagine having that on your shoulders? And he told me it really, really bothered him. But a lot of people there waiting for this to happen in the control room there, Mission Control in Houston. Okay, if you can play the audio here. Okay, you heard them say the picture was upside down and it was very contrasty. What had happened, they took video first from Goldstone, and the operator of the standards converter there was rather inexperienced. The person had inverted the scan top to bottom, so the picture was upside down, and the person didn't really know how to adjust the camera controls, so the contrast was blocked up even worse than you might have expected. They stayed with that picture, NASA did, for just a few seconds or minutes. Then they switched to Honeysuckle Creek and then finally to Parks and got some fairly good video. That's what we watched the rest of the evening that the network carried this video. Very historic video. And I'm not changing there. This was Stan's comment when they saw a sync pulse first and then saw video happen when the door was open and the camera got exposed to light. He said it was pure elation. This tremendous load had been lifted off his shoulders. And of course, a lot of cheering there. You see in the background. CBS, by the way, led the ratings war that night. They were far ahead of NBC and ABC. He was being displayed there. He was very, very pleased that they were getting video too after the successful landing. Again, this was taken with a Hasselblad from inside the spacecraft that shows Armstrong setting the camera up on a stand, or sort of a tripod. And Westinghouse saluted. They got a lot of credit out of this. They bought some ads in magazines, newspapers. They saluted the people at Westinghouse who made this all happen, sort of patted themselves on the back. But it was a very tremendous achievement in television. I've got a lot more to tell you about how they got color back, about the recordings of this, but I don't have time to do it. I've used my time up. Maybe we can talk about this after today's presentation's end in just a few seconds, or maybe I can come back sometime in the future and provide some more information. Again, that summer when I researched this, when I met these people, I ended up writing something like 12,000 words. I cut it back to 8,000 for presentation in the magazines. I can't possibly do anything but scratch the surface of what I learned that summer here in this 30 minutes. Thank you for your time. Okay, we'll take a few if you don't mind staying late. I know I'm keeping you from another event. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I watched the first, the 40th anniversary event
Right.
on NASA TV.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard one of the astronauts saying when he was asked a lot of things about technical progress and blah, and blah, and blah. You know why we did it? To show the damn commies that we can. Is that true?
That was true. Otherwise we would not.
Find that thing on the internet, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, I say otherwise we would not have earmarked $25.4 billion in 1961 just on a lark. This was a major propaganda thing. It was also, a very great scientific mission, but it was propaganda because the Russians, as I say, had beat us twice, getting an artificial satellite in orbit first in 57, and then getting a man in orbit in 61.
I don't say that this is not true, but did he say it on live television? Or?
I don't think that was said on television. That would not have been the sort of journalism that exists right now. You didn't go after somebody's throat. You didn't be that nasty. That just didn't happen. But it was certainly implied. This was a propaganda war with the Soviets, and we wanted to win this round. Yes, please.
I understood there was some controversy about the original recordings of the landing and the film, and that was lost for me.
Yeah, now, if I'd had time, I was going to go into that chapter. I will do this very quickly. As I said, this was a non-standard, non-broadcast standard, slow scan signal, 32010. They recorded this on some high-speed instrumentation recorders where they were recording the data Ampex, and I think Honeywell or Burroughs made the machines. They pull tape at 120 inches per second. One big reel, it was a multi-track thing. They could record 14 tracks on this tape. One reel could only handle about 15 minutes at this speed. So this was where this slow scan video was recorded. They also recorded the converted feed out of these RCA standards converters. The networks recorded it, NASA recorded it. These are 2-inch quad tapes. Those tapes still exist. 2 years before this celebration of the 40th anniversary in 2009, NASA, particularly Dick Napsinger, got interested in locating the original slow scan recordings, thinking with the 21st century technology, we can convert this to nice pristine video, maybe high definition video, because we're not dealing with this clunky camera shooting a cathode ray tube technology. We're going to get a lot better pictures out of this, much better than what people saw on television that night and what's available on this 2-inch quad tape that was recorded from the output of that standards converter. Well, they started looking, and lo and behold, they looked all over, even as far away as Australia. The tapes did not exist. They did find they had been checked in by NASA to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, not long after the mission. A few years later, they had been checked out by somebody at Goddard, Greenbelt, Maryland, for evaluation. This person checked them out, apparently was looking at some of the telemetry, the biomedical information recorded there, maybe the movement of the thrusters on the lunar landing module, who knows. But apparently this person extracted the information he or she wanted, and they were not looking for video. They were not aware that video existed on one of these 14 tracks. And because these tapes were several $100s a reel, they decided to save the government some money and apparently degaussed the tape and reused it for something else. That's speculation, but again, they've been looking now for the last 12 years, and these tapes still have not surfaced. I have a picture I was going to show you. There's a room that Dick Nafziger showed me at Goddard that still has 4 of these instrumentation recorders that can play back these tapes. They were still being maintained. If the tapes were ever located, they could play them back and do something about processing the video with 21st century technology. But yeah, the tapes, as far as we know, were degaussed. That's a very good assumption. Yes?
The colored prints they took that were like on the covers of Life magazine, what were those taken?
Those were taken from the Hasselblad that they carried. They had a couple of Hasselblad cameras, a lot of film cartridges. The Hasselblads, by the way, were left on the moon with the Westinghouse camera. But yeah, those were high quality pictures taken with Hasselblad 120 format cameras. Another question? Yes.
So when he came down the thing, before he had the camera in his hand, it was always pointing towards the ladder so that when he descended, it could take the picture as he came down.
Right. Oh, that was certainly planned, yes. And again, they were waiting. You listen, I didn't play all of the audio, but you listen, and Mission Control tells them to go ahead and set the circuit breaker to turn the camera on. And just a few seconds later, Goldstone, Parks, all these, Honeysuckle Creek, they report they're seeing a signal, a sync bar, and then there's this picture, this picture from the moon live. Yes, a couple more questions?
Yeah, don't forget to mention that we hosted Stan LeVar here 10 years ago and visited the early television.
Right.
And there's a video on the YouTube channel where he tells some more stories about this whole thing. It's definitely
Right. Now, I do need to credit Stan LeVar with, I think I did indirectly, with most of the information I got here. I did spend a very wonderful afternoon with the gentleman there in his home in Maryland. And also, he's provided a lot of the pictures you saw. Some of these others came from NASA, some other sources, some I took. Yes?
One quick comment. If you haven't seen the Apollo 11 movie that came out this year, it's all archival video, film, and audio. It's just like being there. Go see it.
Yeah, I've not seen it, but actually I was participating in a Washington, D.C. section SMPTE managers meeting 2 nights ago, and it was talked about. And yeah, I put it on the bucket list here. I'm going to do that very soon. Yes, over here. Yeah, you first, then I'll take you.
Really quick, you said that Westinghouse already had the tube for that camera designed. What were they intending it for if not a moon mission?
You know, that's a good question. I really don't know. That wasn't covered. But again, there was a big gap at the time between a Vidicon with its lag, its low sensitivity, and the image orthicon, which made a much better picture at a lot more resolution. And I think Westinghouse maybe was trying to fill that niche, maybe getting ready to build a broadcast camera, we don't know, or make the tube available like the Amperex people made the Plumicon available to Norelco, who made the really first successful practical color camera and totally ate RCA's lunch from then on, basically using a Plumicon instead of the big bulky image orthicon. Yes. I'll take.
Contract for the polar orbiting military meteorological satellite that Cameron may have gone on.
That's quite possible. As I said, Westinghouse did have an ace in the hole here because they had some military contracts and they could do custom chip fabrication, and they were designing and building very specialized electron tubes at the time. Yes, your question.
Maybe that'd be something interesting to research would be how many places in the world the Apollo 11 lunar moonwalk telecast was the first live television to be seen from outside of their local areas. I'm thinking of Alaska, for instance, because previously everything in Alaska on TV had been either kinescoped or on videotape.
Yeah, and the military did make special provision to get the video into Alaska. I did come across that when I was putting this together here last week. So, yes.
Well, I was just going to kind of make a comment on the Soviets. You have to remember at the time the Soviets didn't have any live cameras on any of their missions.
No.
In fact, they didn't even announce the dates of their missions until after they were over with. And that was kind of the hallmark of the American space program, was that there were live cameras. If things went good or if things went bad, they were going to show on TV. The United States had nothing to hide. So that was kind of part of the political motivation.
Yeah, you know, I worked for over 30 years with the U.S. Information Agency and its successor, which was the agency that managed the Voice of America. I worked in the video adjunct of the radio side. And when the VOA started service not long after Pearl Harbor, they broadcast to the world, we will report the news. It may be good, it may be bad, but we will always report the truth. And that's what we, as a U.S. society, is dealt in with our government. We deal in openness. The Soviets dealt in darkness, in hiding things. They did not want any of their mistakes to be known. So they, as you say, they did not report any of these missions till after they were successful, after Gagarin got back alive. The wolves didn't eat him, as they did another failed Soviet space mission. But yes, we reported it good or bad. We had live television coverage of some of these early shots. I'm sure you've seen the footage, the rockets going up and then just sort of crumbling, falling back to Earth. We reported our mistakes as well as the successes. Any other questions, comments?
Well, Nixon had a prepared speech that was written in case these guys weren't able to return.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are always contingencies like that. Yeah, you don't, especially at a government level, you don't go into something like this and not be ready for any sort of contingency. I know that goes back to the World War II, the Manhattan Project. They set off a weapon, the first weapon in the desert of New Mexico. And they actually had several contingency news releases. They had an embedded reporter, New York Times reporter, who was there, and he prepared a number of news releases for the press if things didn't really go like they should. And even if it did go like it should, of course, you can't hide a 20 kiloton nuclear blast. So the news release said there was a depot there with a lot of munitions that inadvertently, exploded. And there was also some gas shells. It may require the evacuation of certain areas for a period of time. They're dealing with the radioactive fallout. But that's what they reported to the press. But they also had this guy Lawrence also had another press release ready reporting the mysterious death of a lot of top scientists there in New Mexico in case this thing got out of control and they lost everybody. So yeah, you always prepare for contingencies. Anybody else before we wrap this up? Yeah, one last question.
Your somewhat side comment that perhaps soldiers in Vietnam did not see this broadcast.
Right.
They did.
Well, not all of them, certainly. Not all of them.
There was a television network throughout Vietnam.
Right, but I mean, if you're fighting there on the front lines, you don't have a television set handy. That's what I'm saying. The exception of some of our armed service people in Vietnam. But by and large, I think anybody that wanted to see it did see it that night. It was a very, very, very memorable night. Just a show of hands, how many people were alive in 1969 in July? Okay, how many people saw the broadcast? So great. So you know whereof I speak. It was a very, very moving time for me. I was a young man. I was 22. And to see this, said, my God, we're bringing back video from the moon. How can we top this? And I don't think we've really done it with live television since then. We've had a lot of great events on, but I think this was probably the most spectacular.
Michael Collins did not see it.
No, he did not. Actually, I think when he was orbiting, he was looking, trying to see where they had landed. He was trying to spot that. The orbital time was about 2.5 hours. He'd make a pass. So, yeah. Thank you.